Hello, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video, we'll be talking about dural venous sinuses. Our big objective for this video is to map out the dural venous sinuses and talk about where the majority of these will eventually drain. So our big objective is to map out the sinuses, but before we do that, I want to start off just by simply answering the question of what is a dural venous sinus? And the simplest answer is that they are collecting and drainage pools for venous blood coming back from the brain. But while they act like a vein, their structure is slightly different. So veins have a particular makeup. So they have specific layers of endothelium, smooth muscle, connective tissue, all arranged in a nice tubular structure. But what makes up the walls of these sinuses is actually dura mater, which is the tough outermost layer of meninges that surround the brain and spinal cord. So meninges are addressed in detail in a separate video, so please make sure you watch that one as well. But for our purposes here, it is enough to understand that dura mater is the outermost meninx, and that within the cranial cavity, so we're talking about just the portion that surrounds the brain, not the spinal cord. Within the cranial cavity, that dura has two distinct layers. All right, the periosteal layer, just like its name suggests, hugs the bones of the cranial cavity. Okay, so let me just pull up a laser pointer here. All right, so we can see periosteal layer here, hugging those cranial bones. All right. The meningeal layer then is just below it, and the meningeal layer hugs the surface of the brain and it follows it into its major contour. So that longitudinal fissure and the gap between the cerebrum and cerebellum both have big dips of meningeal dura that follow them down there. Now, this creates a space here where these two layers mismatch, all right? So there's a big gap between our periosteal dura and our meningeal dura. All right. And this empty space, well, not empty, but for right now, we're going to pretend it's empty, is what we're calling the dural sinus. Now, the space is not actually empty. The insides here are lined with endothelium, just like a vein. And bridging veins are going to carry blood that has been used by the cerebrum and cerebellum into the sinus. So some veins drain specific portions of the brain, and then those veins are going to dump into these dural venous sinuses. Okay, so most of the blood that has been utilized by the brain is going to end up in one of these dural venous sinuses, all right? They also receive blood from a few sources outside the cranium, okay? So these would be the ophthalmic veins that drain the eye and the orbit. We have a couple of what are called emissary veins that drain the scalp and then travel through the cranial bones to empty into the dural venous sinuses. So what was an empty space now becomes full of venous blood. All of that blood, of course, needs a way to drain from the cranial cavity and get back to the heart. And the main route for venous blood out of the cranial cavity is going to be through the internal jugular vein. So that is where we're going to find the vast majority of these sinuses draining to eventually. So as you can see in the illustration here, these sinuses all kind of connect to one another to create a drainage pathway that eventually ends up down here in the internal jugular. So let's take a walk through that. We're going to go backwards because I find that that is the easiest way to reinforce that these connections really are a drainage pathway and the ultimate destination is going to be the internal jugular vein. All right, so just proximal to the formation of the internal jugular vein is the sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid means S-shaped, so the sinus takes the name from this little bend in it as it travels down to the jugular foramen. The sigmoid sinus is the continuation of the transverse sinus. Transverse sinus runs in the outer margin of a structure called the tentorium cerebelli, which is one of those dural infoldings, this time between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. All right, here's another way of looking at this. on the right over here, we have a cranium that the brain has been removed from, and we can see the dura mater as this shiny white membrane here. All right, this portion here that I'm outlining for you with the laser pointer, this is the tentorium cerebelli. So that sits in between the cerebrum and cerebellum. And in its outermost margin here, we can see some discoloration. Now, I am going to bring your attention down here to the left. And in this image, the tentorium cerebelli has been cut away. And the meningeal layer of the dura has actually been dissected through, opened up to expose the inside of the transverse sinus here, and then the sigmoid sinus there. Okay? The next handful of sinuses here all drain to the transverse sinus at a single point called the confluence of sinuses. This point tends to be at the midpoint right between the right and left transverse sinuses, just like you see on the illustration there. And the sinuses that drain into it all run in the median sagittal plane. So in the center of the cranial cavity, in between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum or the cerebellum. The straight sinus travels straight back in that median sagittal plane to the confluence of sinuses. And that is further draining what's called the inferior sagittal sinus. This runs in the inferior margin of another dural infolding here called the falx cerebri. The superior margin of the falx cerebri also has a venous sinus, and we call that one the superior sagittal sinus. Now, one thing that I want to make super clear here is that the superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus, and the straight sinus are all related to this midline dural infolding called the falx cerebri. So the superior sagittal sinus is up here. This white stuff here is the falx cerebri, and then in its inferior margin, we've got the inferior sagittal sinus. The straight sinus runs right here in this junction between the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli, and these are all heading right back here to the confluence of sinuses. And last but not least, we have this tiny little occipital sinus that runs up between the cerebellar hemispheres to join the confluence of sinuses from below. All right, that also drains back here to the confluence of sinuses. So just to this one spot, we've got the occipital sinus, the superior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, and the inferior sagittal via that straight sinus all draining. That blood will then travel out laterally through the transverse sinuses. So here, or if we're looking on this picture over here, then it will dip down as part of the sigmoid sinus. So what happens here is the transverse sinus flows, and then it changes its name to sigmoid sinuses. So you don't want to think of them as separate structures, just contiguous structures. They are connected and they all make one nice pathway. All right, so transverse sigmoid down to internal jugular vein and out of the cranial cavity. So this pathway covers a lot of drainage, but if you are quite astute, which I am sure you are, you've also noticed this business going on right here and have maybe been wondering what's going on with that. So let's take a look there. So that business there represents the cavernous sinus, which is a relatively large sinus that sits posterior and medial to the orbits and kind of brackets the sella turcica where that pituitary gland sat on the sphenoid bone. So here's the cavernous sinus here. It can be a little bit difficult to represent visually. So let me show you. Here, on this image, it's actually right here. And it is just not as easy to make out as some of the other sinuses that we see here. All right. You don't see this dark shadowing like you do on a lot of these other ones. All right, but it's still there, and it has a specific drainage pathway. So let's walk through it. Our target, again, is going to be the internal jugular vein. So now it's right here. But this time, we need to move blood posteriorly and medially to reach it. All right, and we're going to do that through two petrosal sinuses. So these are named for the petrosal portion of the temporal bone, which is this big block of bone right here. We have the superior petrosal sinus here that I'm following. That's going to drain into the sigmoid sinus, which then drains down into the internal jugular vein. The other pathway that blood from the cavernous sinus can drain is the inferior petrosal sinus here. And that will take you directly right down into the internal jugular vein itself. All right, this type of map here is something that I generally prefer to keep with the written learning objectives rather than including it in a lecture. But I wanted to include it here in our first week of class here to give you an example of ways that you might take some of this information and rearrange it to make your own materials to study with. And really all that's been done here is to remove the images and remove some of the complicated shapes and pathways and just connect everything here with straight lines so that you can follow paths of drainage all the way down to the internal jugular veins. So use this as an example of a good practice to practice with. All right, and then it's going to bring us to the end of the material. So here is your review question. Which of the following sinuses does not connect directly to the confluence of sinuses? All right, the correct answer here was A, the inferior sagittal sinus. While the inferior sagittal sinus does, in fact, eventually drain down to the confluence of sinuses, it does so by first emptying into the straight sinus, which then travels back to the confluence of sinuses. All right, that is going to bring us to the end. Thank you for joining me.